All right, guys, what's up, and welcome to Diabetes Talk. I'm your host, Charlie O'Connell, and tonight's topic is my family member has diabetes. What we're going to be talking about is the risk that you as a family member may have in getting diabetes. We're also going to talk about how you can be supportive of your family member that has diabetes. And this is one of the most important topics, one of the most frequent topics that we come across when we're working with members in the GLUCOSEZONE is dealing either with family members or questions from family members. So our goal is to really break that down for you tonight. Now, let's start off with actually understanding and bringing some clarity to the genetic component of diabetes. So the first thing, and we're going to start with type 1 diabetes. So type 1 diabetes does not have a genetic component, okay? What that means is very important to understand is you are not at risk for type 1 diabetes. You are not going to inherit type 1 diabetes if you have a family member that has type 1 diabetes. So let's just start off with that. Type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune disease. And what happens with type 1 diabetes is, and this is interesting because the actual scenario and causes of type 1 diabetes are not fully understood by the scientific community. But what is understood is that type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune disease where your immune system actually mistakenly attacks your pancreas and shuts down your pancreas's ability to produce insulin. That is what the actual cause of type 1 diabetes is. It is not something that you inherit. Now, having said that, if you have a family member that has type 1 diabetes, there is a slight increase in the potential that you acquire type 1 diabetes yourself. The best thing to do is if you have concern about, let's say that you have, for example, a brother or sister or parent, okay, that has type 1 diabetes, and you're concerned about your susceptibility to have type 1 diabetes, you should talk with your healthcare provider. There are ways to test for certain biomarkers that indicate likelihood and susceptibility of developing type 1 diabetes. But to be clear, type 1 diabetes is not something that you contract, okay? And there is not a genetic component like there is with type 2 diabetes. Other important thing with type 1 diabetes is it is true that the more family members that you have with type 1 diabetes, there is a higher chance that you develop type 1 diabetes. And I'm a member of the Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation, and over the years I have met families of people living with type 1 diabetes. But having said that, that is actually very rare, and to be honest, and to be quite frank, the scientific community does not really truly understand what the causes of type 1 diabetes are, okay? And ultimately, what causes one person to develop type 1 diabetes and one person not to, okay? All right. Now, let's talk about type 2 diabetes. So, type 2 diabetes, there is a genetic component to the development of type 2 diabetes, and that genetic component sometimes gets confused, and people mistake that they inherit type 2 diabetes. So to be very clear, you do not inherit type 2 diabetes. Okay? Now, some people are genetically susceptible to type 2 diabetes, and the reason why that is you have to understand what type 2 diabetes is. So what type 2 diabetes is characterized as a chronic condition characterized by high blood sugar levels and resistance to insulin. Okay? Now, let's really break that down. Your body is designed to store sugar, okay? And your body is designed to store sugar in specific places. And if you've heard me speak before, you know I've talked about the parking lot analogy. So you have parking lots for sugar in your body. And those parking lots are your brain, your liver, your muscle, and your fat tissue. Now, when you eat food, that food converts into glucose, and that glucose molecule will travel to the different parking lots looking for a place to be stored. And the first parking lot that it looks for is your brain. The glucose molecule will travel to your brain and it will check, are there any empty spaces? And if there are, the glucose molecule will go in there. If not, the glucose molecule will travel to the next parking lot, which is your liver. Now, your liver can store between 70 and 80 grams worth of carbohydrate. If the glucose molecule, carbohydrate, when you hear the term carbohydrate, and this is very important to understand, this is one of the things that's challenging about diabetes, is there are a lot of confusing terms and many of the terms sound similar. So carbohydrate is a reference to a food, okay? But it is also, in this case, synonymous with a glucose molecule, okay? So your liver has the ability to store between 70 and 80 grams worth of carbohydrate. If a glucose molecule shows up to your liver and there's room inside your liver, the glucose molecule will go in there. But if there is no room, it doesn't matter how much insulin is present in your body. If there's no room for the storage of glucose in your liver, there's no room for the storage of glucose in your liver. And in that case, the glucose molecule travels to the next parking lot, which is your muscle tissue. Now, your muscles are very different than your liver. You can store anywhere from 200 to 800 grams worth of carbohydrate in your muscles. And in fact, your muscles are the primary tissue that glucose is designed to be stored in, and your muscle tissue is the primary tissue that insulin is designed to interact with. Now, if a glucose molecule shows up to your muscle parking lot and there's room, the glucose molecule will go in there. But if not, it doesn't matter how much insulin is present in your body, no more glucose can be stored in your muscles if there's no room. And if that's the case, the glucose molecule travels to the last parking lot, which is the fat parking lot. Now, your fat parking lot is like the long-term parking at JFK Airport. You're going to circle around a couple times before committing to that parking lot. It's also the largest parking lot. So the average human being has 30 to 40 billion adipocyte cells. Adipocyte cells are the actual cells that make up your adipocyte tissue. Adipocyte tissue is your fat tissue. When those 30 to 40 billion adipocyte cells are filled with glucose, that represents between 30 and 40 pounds of fat. And so what's important to understand is that 30 to 40 pounds of fat is actually the healthy limit of fat storage. Now, depending on your genetics, once you go over 30 to 40 pounds of excess fat, you become susceptible to high blood sugar levels. And the susceptibility to high blood sugar levels directly related to your ability to create more fat cells. So let me really explain that, because it's important to understand. There's a TV show here in the United States that's called My 600-Pound Life. And it's a reality TV show about people who weigh 600, 700, or 800 pounds. People who weigh 600 or 700 or 800 pounds, their body's physiology is fundamentally different than the general population. And what's different about them is they have the ability to continuously build more fat parking lots. It's a condition called adipocyte hyperplasia. They literally can multiply and create more fat tissue for the storage of excess glucose. That is how somebody can weigh 600 or 700 pounds and not have type 2 diabetes. For people, for the general population, and specifically for people that are genetically susceptible to type 2 diabetes, they do not have the ability to continuously build more fat parking lots. Their fat parking lot is limited, okay? And if you fall into that category, if your genetics do not allow you to have multiplication of fat cells, you are genetically susceptible to type 2 diabetes if you go over 30 to 40 pounds of being overweight. And the simple reason for that is literally your body has run out of room to store the sugar. Okay? And that's a very, very important thing to understand, and generally speaking is an easy way to understand genetic susceptibility to type 2 diabetes. Now, while you may inherit that genetic susceptibility, you do not automatically inherit type 2 diabetes. Having said that, many people inherit food behavior, many people inherit physical activity behavior. And if your food behavior is characterized by lack of portion control and making nutritional choices where you're consuming highly processed foods, that is going to lead to a lot of calories and a lot of excess sugar. If you've inherited a lifestyle of a lack of physical activity, that means that your muscle parking lot is going to be very small. Now, let's talk about that for a second. Increasing your muscle mass is one of the most effective ways in bringing type 2 diabetes into remission. And it has to do with the simple fact that your muscles are the actual primary storage places for sugar. And something that's important to understand is after the age of 25, our bodies start to naturally lose muscle mass. And that muscle mass can be lost at up to 2% per year if we don't exercise. So if you are 45 years old and you haven't exercised for 20 years, you can actually have lost up to 40% of your actual muscle mass. What that means from a diabetes perspective is you've actually lost 40% of your ability to store sugar. Okay? This is why exercise has such a fundamental impact on glucose management, has such a fundamental impact on type 2 diabetes, the control of type 2 diabetes, and the prevention of type 2 diabetes. If you are at risk for type 2 diabetes, what is the first thing your doctor says? I want you to increase your exercise, and I want you to work on your nutritional habits. Because your doctor knows that most likely, if you can increase your muscle mass and stop consuming high-calorie, highly processed foods, most likely your diabetes, you will halt the progression of diabetes. The other piece of that recommendation, and this is equally important, is if you do actually increase your physical activity and if you actually do improve your nutritional choices and habits and you don't see an improvement in your diabetic condition, that is fundamental information that your doctor needs to help actually prescribe to you the appropriate medication. And this is where now many people get confused. So in reality, there are actually 8 different causes of hyperglycemia. Hyperglycemia means high blood sugar. If you follow your doctor's recommendation If you join us here in the GlucoSezone and you do exercise every day for 90 days and you improve your nutrition habits and you don't see an improvement in your diabetes, that is fundamental important information that your doctor needs to know in order to actually prescribe to you the correct medication to address the cause of your hyperglycemia. And I cannot stress enough how important that is in terms of getting back control of your life, because we have seen so many people come into GlucoSezone that are on 4, 5, even 6 different diabetes medications, and they haven't actually done the exercise piece. And by incorporating the exercise piece, clarity then becomes immediate in terms of what is the appropriate medication and what is the appropriate amounts of the different medications. Okay? So that's an easy way to understand the genetic susceptibility of type 1 diabetes, the genetic susceptibility of type 2 diabetes. Okay? Now what I want to talk about, okay, is supporting and being an actual asset to your family member who has diabetes. And this is one of the most important things I want to encourage anybody, any member of GlucoSezone that has a family member that you are in this with, encourage them to watch this video. So the first thing is, if one family member has diabetes, basically the whole family has diabetes. And that's very important to acknowledge for both the person living with diabetes as well as the family member that is supporting the person with diabetes. One person has diabetes, the whole family has diabetes, because diabetes is a very management-intensive disease. Now, if you have a family member that has diabetes, there are positive ways that you can be supportive, and there are negative ways that you can irritate and be non-supportive. And sometimes it's not so intuitive what those things are. So we want to take this opportunity to talk about it. Let's start off with the ways that you can be supportive. The first thing is acknowledging that nobody deserves diabetes. Very, very important. There's not a single person living with diabetes, regardless of the type of diabetes, that deserves to have diabetes. Okay? That's number one. Number two, I personally have never met a person that wanted to have uncontrolled diabetes. What I have met are many, many people who don't know what to do about their diabetes. Okay? So that's the second piece here, is that acknowledging that this is a challenging thing, nobody asked to have this disease, and many times it can be very, very hard to actually get back control. The third thing, okay, is acknowledging that exercise for people living with diabetes is different. So just telling somebody to go for a walk or passing that judgment on somebody living with diabetes about their fitness level or their commitment to fitness, that is not helpful, because exercise and diabetes is fundamentally different proposition. Okay? Starting with the need to test blood sugar. The other piece is passing judgment on food is that is a recipe for a negative interaction and being unhelpful. So when it comes to food, the best thing that you can do as a family member trying to be supportive of your family member that has diabetes is really 3 things. The first thing is make a commitment to eating healthy yourself. Number 2, make a commitment to understanding what the person living with diabetes has to account for when they are making food decisions. Number 3, understand the implications and impact of the medications that they're taking for their diabetes. Those 3 things can go such a long way into being supportive of your family member. When it comes to fitness, making a commitment to understanding what is different about exercise and diabetes, making a commitment to understanding that depending on the person's blood sugar level, it may or may not be safe to exercise, and they may need different types of support based on that blood sugar level. The third piece, okay, is understanding your role if the family member is struggling managing their diabetes. And that comes in usually 2 places. The first place is projecting out frustration or anxiety about the family member's diabetes. And we see this all the time with parents of kids with type 1 diabetes. They don't realize that they are projecting onto their kids the frustration and anxiety of their child having type 1, and their kid internalizes that. And it's a very, very damaging psychological experience. Okay? So if you are a parent, if you're a family member that's in that situation, I want you to be really, really conscious of that. The second piece is, if you are a family member and your partner or your wife or your husband has diabetes, especially type 2 diabetes, if you are going to actually be supportive, a lot of that has to do with making smart and healthy food choices and being willing to control your portions, being willing to count carbs, being willing to look for healthy alternatives, even if that's not necessarily something that you need at that moment. That can go such a long way to being helpful to the person living with diabetes. All right. Generally speaking, that is an overview of understanding my family member has diabetes. I do want to come back to type 1 diabetes and just explain a little bit more, okay, what the actual genetic and familial associations are. And there's some specific information that I want to share. So keeping in mind that the cause of type 1 diabetes is not fully understood, there are some stats, and these particular stats come from the Joslin Diabetes Center, which is located in Boston, Massachusetts. And these are stats that are relevant, okay? So if you have an immediate relative, that would be a parent, a brother, a sister, a son or a daughter that has type 1 diabetes, your risk of developing type 1 diabetes is 10 times the risk of the general population. Now, I don't want, that could sound high, 10 times the risk, but the risk of the general population developing diabetes is less than 1 in 300. Okay? The next one is, if one child in a family has type 1 diabetes, the siblings have about a 1 in 10 risk of developing diabetes by age 50. So that is a correlation, okay? If you have a sister or brother that has type 1 diabetes, you definitely have a higher risk of developing type 1 diabetes. But again, there's nothing concrete. There is no direct connection of genetic susceptibility between type 1 diabetes and siblings or immediate relatives. Okay? The next one has to do with the risk for a child of a parent with type 1 diabetes. So if you are, and we're going to start with the mother. So if you are the child of a mother that has type 1 diabetes, and this is interesting, your risk for developing type 1 diabetes yourself is lower. If the father has it, there is an increased risk. The risk is about 1 in 10 that the child will develop type 1 diabetes. If the mother has type 1 diabetes and is age 25 or younger when the child is born, the risk is reduced to 1 in 25. Okay? So basically, there's anywhere from a 4% to 10% chance that if you have a parent that has type 1 diabetes, that you may develop type 1 diabetes. And ultimately, guys, this is what I want to communicate about type 1 diabetes, because I'm a person living with type 1 diabetes, is if you have an immediate family member that has type 1 diabetes, your risk of developing type 1 diabetes is increased. But the important thing to understand is that increase is very small. We're talking about a 4 to 10% increase in risk from the general population. And the second thing, very important to understand and keep in mind, is that unfortunately, the actual cause of type 1 diabetes is yet to really truly be understood. Now, having said that, if you are concerned, okay, if you are really, really concerned about your risk for developing type 1 or type 2 or any other form of diabetes, you should really, really talk to your healthcare provider. Now, the last type of diabetes that we're going to talk about tonight is a diabetes called MODY diabetes. And what MODY diabetes stands for is maturity onset diabetes of the young. MODY is a rare form of diabetes, okay, which is different from both type 1 and type 2 diabetes, and it does run strong in families. What maturity onset diabetes of the young is caused by is an actual genetic mutation in a single gene. And there are at least 4 different genetic mutations that may result in MODY. If a parent has this gene mutation, any child they have has a 50% chance of inheriting that gene mutation. Okay? And ultimately, that gene mutation ultimately represents a change and ultimately represents the development of MODY diabetes. So, MODY diabetes is, the characteristics of MODY diabetes are different from type 1 and type 2. So the person, it's different from type 2 because the person does not exhibit the typical or kind of standard development of type 2 diabetes signs. There's no obesity involved, there's no consumption of highly processed foods, and lack of activity. At the same time, it's not like the development of type 1 diabetes where the person loses weight. Okay? So MODY diabetes is in and of itself is a very, very different type of diabetes. It's caused by a genetic mutation that occurs, and that genetic mutation does run in families. So of all the types of diabetes that we talked about today, MODY, which is maturity onset diabetes of the young, does have the strongest familial correlation. And if you are concerned that you have MODY diabetes, or if you know that you have MODY diabetes and you're having trouble finding the right medication to address that cause, that genetic mutation, you really need to reach out to your healthcare provider or reach out to us here at GlucoZone, and we'll do our best to connect you with the best resource that can really, really help you take back control of your life and get back control of your diabetes. All right. On that note, that was exactly 30 minutes. I want to thank you guys for listening. I'm hopeful that this helped to answer some of your questions. Always, guys, feel free to reach out to our digital coaches here in the GlucoZone. We can't wait to answer your questions. And on that note, we'll see you soon.